Hi, I'm Paul Peterson.
I'm Chris Sun Liu. Part 2 of the Presidency. Let's talk about the President's hard powers. Professor Peterson, let's get into it. What are the hard powers that the President actually has?
Well, there's four: the power to veto, the power to appoint, the power to pardon, and the most important, the inherent powers.
As we always do, let's go through these one by one. What is the President's power to veto?
Well, before any law takes effect, it must be approved by the President, says the Constitution. However, Congress can repass that bill, and if it gets 2/3 vote in the Senate and 2/3 vote in the House, then it will become law despite what the President has done. So there is a check on the veto power.
Do presidents use the veto power often, and has this changed at all over time?
It's changed a lot over time. Before the Civil War, the presidents hardly ever vetoed anything. It was very controversial if they did. It gradually was used with some frequency during the 19th century and even more in the early part of the 20th century. But it's faded away, almost back down to levels that existed before the Civil War. So there's been a huge change in the use of the veto power, especially in recent years.
That's interesting. Why has the veto power slipped away in recent decades?
I think it's because of communications. The fact that everybody knows whether or not there's a 2/3 vote on Capitol Hill, then everybody knows whether or not the president will get what he wants if he does veto the bill. And so the president only has to threaten the veto. He doesn't actually have to veto in order to get what the president desires. Now that's one fact. The other fact works in the opposite direction. Congress, in order to keep the president from vetoing laws, passes fewer laws, but puts more and more stuff in them. So anytime the president vetoes a piece of legislation, the government is about to be shut down. A great big problem is going to be created if the president actually vetoes a piece of legislation. So in the game that's taking place between White House and Capitol Hill, the president is going to threaten vetoes, and Congress is going to modify its great big package, and they're each going to play this game trying to maximize their political power. Now, you can see from this slide just how much of a decline in the number of bills passed by Congress has occurred since 1948. And you can see that in 2011, 2012, that black line, there's hardly any bills being passed in any year. On the other hand, the number of pages in the bill has increased enormously. So we now have very long bills and very few bills. And that's all designed to get around the power of the veto.
There's also a special kind of veto with a very special name, a pocket veto. What is that?
Well, that's a good name to keep in mind, Chris, because it's easy to put that on the final examination, pocket veto. What is that after all? Well, the pocket veto is a great veto because it's one that the president can use and Congress can't do anything about it. There's a 10-day rule that says that anytime a law comes to the president during the last days of Congress, the president has to sign it, or it will become law in any case. But the president might veto it during those 10 days, but Congress has already gone home. Well, then they have to start all over again and reenact the law again. So you can see that the pocket veto is the best of all. You can see that in this slide that the pocket veto, when the veto was being widely used, was in fact one of the most popular versions of the veto, although that's all but disappeared, partly because Congress remains in session almost all the time. So the opportunities to do a pocket veto have been greatly reduced.
Let's move on to the second power on our list, the appointment power. Who does the president have the power to appoint?
Well, the Constitution says that the president shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, and all other officers of the United States. Well, the president can also appoint Supreme Court justices and federal court judges. And all that Congress can do is advise and consent. However, that means that the Senate has to give a majority vote to anybody who's nominated by the president. So we shall discuss that a lot more when we talk about the power to appoint people to the cabinet. And we discussed it more with the judiciary. So we won't go over it here. What we'll talk about here more is the power to appoint the White House staff.
The White House staff is a unique group of people because many of these appointments, with one important exception, don't need to be confirmed on Capitol Hill. Can we talk about this a little more?
Yeah, it's sort of neat that the president can appoint officers that are really important without any approval of Congress at all. This is one of the ways the president has expanded power in recent years. The members of the White House staff do not need to be confirmed by the Senate, and the Senate has never changed that rule. That's a law that's out there that Congress could change. And the reason Congress doesn't change it is because they can appoint their staff without anybody approving it. So the president has said, if you're going to make me have Senate confirmation for my staff, then I'm going to have control over the appointments to your staff. So they've made a bargain, and the bargain allows the president to appoint his top political operatives to positions inside the White House. Now, these are the people who worked in his political campaign. And if they had to go through the Senate confirmation process, they probably wouldn't get through because they're so involved in political life. But they often become some of the key decision makers within the government.
Have presidents always had staff members helping them inside the White House?
Not to the same extent that they do today. There's at least 500, probably many more, such individuals within the White House today. But when Abraham Lincoln was president, there were only 2. So this has been a great big expansion of the presidential appointment power. And it happened again during the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration. He appointed a commission, and the commission came back and told the president what he wanted to hear. He wanted to hear that he needed help, and that's what they said. The president needs help. And they said, you need some assistants who will have high competence, great physical vigor, and a passion for anonymity. And that's exactly the way you should think about the White House staff. These are people who have high competence, great physical vigor. They work day and night. They're totally exhausted by the time they leave office, and they have a passion for anonymity that's pretty much imposed upon them, because if they say anything to the press, they're going to lose their job. Now, you can see how the White House staff has increased over the years. It increased especially between Truman and Nixon, and then that became an issue with Watergate, and so then it became smaller, at least appeared to be smaller in subsequent administrations, has now popped up in the Obama administration. So the White House staff is an exceedingly important part of the U.S. government.
There was one important exception to the rule that White House staff appointments can bypass Senate confirmation. Who is this important individual?
Well, the one concession that the president has made to Congress is that the chief of the White House staff shall be confirmed by the Senate. And so you've got some very strong figures that have held that position. And they only held that position because they were confirmed by the Senate. We think of James Baker as the person who was able to design the Reagan Revolution And Howard Baker was able to run the government in the last 2 years of the Reagan administration when the president himself was probably not in full command of his resources. But there have been some weak examples of the White House chief of staff. And John Sununu was one who was not very effective during the early years of the George H.W. Bush administration. Bill Daley, when he came into that position for Barack Obama, served only for about a few months before it was clear that even though his brother had been mayor of Chicago, he wasn't quite the same political operator. So sometimes you get absolutely powerful White House chiefs of staff who essentially become presidents, and sometimes you have fairly weak ones. So there's been a lot of variety over the years.
In addition to the White House staff, I often hear this term, the executive office of the president. Are these two interchangeable, or is there a major difference?
It's important to make the distinction because the White House staff is only one component of the executive office of the president. Another very important component is the Office of Management and Budget, and they're responsible for coordinating all the departments and agencies. But there are a lot of other little entities that have been stuck into the executive office of the president that really should belong somewhere else in the government, but they've been placed in this position. So when thinking about the White House staff, you got to make sure that you don't confuse it with the executive office of the president.
Professor Peterson, sometimes it seems that scandals are especially likely to come out of the White House. Why is this the case?
Well, I think there are three reasons. One, the opposition party wants to nail the president. If they can get a scandal going inside the White House, that's a good way to do it. Secondly, reporters are looking for a great story. There's no better story than scandal inside the White House. And finally, the White House tends to recruit risk takers because political campaigns are filled with risk takers. They're taking a chance on spending so much of their life and so much of their energy supporting somebody who might never become president at all. And it has to be said that President Obama has been very fortunate not to have had a scandal inside the White House because many of his predecessors have experienced that, whether it was Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush or whether it was Bill Clinton. So we don't know whether that was because there's been a Democratic Senate ever since Barack Obama became president. And should that change in 2014 and the Republicans get control of the Senate, could their power of investigation lead to a search for scandals inside the White House? It's possible.
The third power on our list is the power to pardon. Do presidents use this power often?
The best example is Gerald Ford pardoning Richard Nixon. And he became very unpopular as a result. But it was probably the right thing to do because we do not think it's a good idea for presidents of the United States to be indicted and prosecuted in the court of law. So that's the best example. Other examples do occur, but they almost always occur in the very last years or last days a president is in office because the power to pardon criminals can become a very controversial exercise of presidential power.
Finally, let's talk about the inherent powers, which you pointed out are some of the most important powers of the president. What do we mean by inherent powers?
Yeah, we're saving the best to last. The inherent powers are conveyed by the clause in the Constitution that says the executive power shall be vested in a president. Well, it doesn't sound like much, but that power has been used to give the president the capacity to write executive orders that have the same legal standing as laws of Congress. So in fact, the President of the United States can pass a law simply by issuing an executive order. And there's only two things that Congress can do about it. One is they can pass a law that overrides that executive order, but that means the House and the Senate has to agree. You got to get majorities in both houses. Or they can impeach the president. which is pretty impossible.
While it's hard to know what the Constitution really meant by executive power, the way it's played out, it's really got a life of its own.
Yes, you're absolutely right. There's no reason to think that Congress ever thought that executive power meant anything other than enforcing the law. But presidents since Abraham Lincoln have used this power to do pretty dramatic things. In the case of Lincoln, he sent naval ships to reinforce Fort Sumter by use of the executive order. And that many people have identified as the cause of the Civil War. In the case of Teddy Roosevelt, he created national monuments by means of an executive order. He, in fact, made so many of them that Congress passed a law and forced Teddy Roosevelt to sign it, which placed a limit on the number of national monuments he could create. And the day before he signed that bill into law, he created 40 more national monuments. Here's an example, Devil's Tower in Wyoming. I've never been there, though I'm really eager to go. That's a neat place, everybody tells me. So anyhow, Teddy Roosevelt said, "It was my belief that it was not only the president's right, but his duty to do anything that the needs of the nation demanded, unless such action was forbidden by the Constitution or by its laws." So Teddy Roosevelt had a very expanded notion of the executive power of the president, and he used that power any chance he could. Harry Truman used the executive order to desegregate the armed forces. John Kennedy used executive power to end housing discrimination by realtors, and he allowed federal employees to engage in collective bargaining when he issued an executive order to that effect. So then you come to examples where the use of executive orders can create problems for the president. And we've alluded to this in the past. When Ronald Reagan was president, he said no gays may participate in the military. And it was an executive order that he used to make that decision. Clinton tried to reverse that. But then Congress threatened to override his reversal. And it looked as if they actually had the power to do that. And so Clinton does not actually issue that executive order. That was one of the mistakes he made during the very early days of his administration.
Executive orders sound like a really good deal for the president. Have presidents been using this with more frequency?
They have, Chris. Here's a slide that shows that back in the 19th century, they hardly ever issued executive orders. But once the Supreme Court said executive orders had the full force of law, just as if they had been passed by Congress, then presidents began using the executive order much more frequently, and that's continued right down to the present time.
Executive orders right now are actually a central point for a major controversy playing out in American politics. What's happening right now?
Well, President Obama has actually, for the first time, said that executive power is the way he's going to try to get things done, because divided government has crippled Congress and they can't pass any laws. And since Congress doesn't pass very many laws anymore, this is pretty persuasive. So he's done a lot of things by executive order, including modifying the Health Care Act, the Affordable Care Act. He has waived provisions of the education law, No Child Left Behind, so that many states no longer have to comply with many of them. And he's promising to bring about immigration reform through executive order. So the reaction on Capitol Hill has been divided along party lines. In the House of Representatives, controlled by the president, there's been a move to file a lawsuit that says Obama's use of the executive power is unconstitutional. So this could go to court, and we don't know how it's going to come out. But it cuts new ground constitutionally, and most people think that it's unlikely that the House of Representatives is going to win this case, because they're going to probably decide that Congress can pass a law revising the executive order if they don't like it, just as they threatened to do with Bill Clinton. They don't need to file a lawsuit over the case.
Professor Peterson, how would you sum up our discussion of presidential power?
Well, there are soft powers and there are hard powers. Both have grown in significance continuously throughout the 20th century. Nonetheless, the president is still checked by Congress because Congress funds the government. It decides whether or not there will be a budget for the next year. And that power is unchallenged by presidents. And so there will always be a sharing of power.
In part 3, we'll move on to presidential politics.